A man stands 6 feet 6 inches tall, weighing 240 pounds of pure muscle, with a chest measuring 48 inches and a waist just 32 inches. He's lying on an operating table, completely lifeless. 2 doctors have already pronounced him dead. A ski pole has pierced straight through his heart. His family is preparing for the worst. But then something impossible happens. Something that defies every medical explanation. And this isn't even the most unbelievable story about the man we're talking about today. When you hear what really happened behind the scenes of Hollywood's golden era, when you discover the secrets this gentle giant kept hidden for decades, and when you learn about the battles he fought that had nothing to do with the Western scripts he performed, you'll understand why no one believed these stories until the evidence became impossible to ignore. They called him Cheyenne. To millions of television viewers across America in the 1950s and 60s, Clint Walker was the ultimate cowboy hero. Strong, silent, honorable, and seemingly invincible. He was the man who launched an entire television revolution, the first star of the first hour-long Western series in television history. But the person you saw on screen was just a carefully crafted image. The real Clint Walker? His story makes his fictional adventures look tame by comparison. Born Norman Eugene Walker on May 30th, 1927 in Hartford, Illinois, he came into this world alongside his fraternal twin sister, Lucy. Even from birth, there was something different about Norman. While his sister grew to average height, Norman kept growing and growing. Their father, Paul Arnold Walker, worked as a laborer for Shell Oil, doing backbreaking work for minimal pay. Their mother, Gladys Hulda Schwanda Walker, was a Czech immigrant who had crossed an ocean searching for the American dream. But this was the heart of the Great Depression, and the American dream felt more like a distant fantasy than an attainable reality. Growing up in Depression-era Illinois meant that childhood ended early. There were no soccer practices, no summer camps, no carefree days of youth. There was only survival. Young Norman watched his parents struggle to put food on the table. He saw his father come home exhausted every night, his mother stretching every penny until it screamed. And he made a decision that would shape the trajectory of his entire life. He decided he was done with school. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he couldn't learn, but because his family needed him. So Norman Eugene Walker walked out of school and straight into the workforce. He took a job at a factory, working machinery that could easily crush a man if he lost focus for even a second. The pay was meager, but it was something. It helped. Then he found work as a riverboat worker on the Mississippi, loading and unloading cargo, battling the elements, developing the kind of raw physical strength that would later become his trademark. But the young man from Illinois had bigger dreams. At 17 years old, when most teenagers today are worrying about prom dates and college applications, Norman Eugene Walker joined the United States Merchant Marine. Imagine that for a moment. 17 years old, and he's sailing across oceans, potentially into war zones, seeing parts of the world most people only read about in books. The Merchant Marine during and after World War II was no pleasure cruise. These were the unsung heroes who kept supply lines open, who braved submarine-infested waters, who faced storms that could swallow ships whole. The experience toughened him in ways that a million gym workouts never could. It taught him discipline, resilience, and what it truly meant to face danger. It also gave him something else, time to dream. During those long voyages across endless expanses of water, Norman would think about what came next. What could a poor kid from Illinois with minimal education actually achieve in life? After his time in the Merchant Marine ended, Norman drifted through a series of odd jobs. He worked as a carnival roustabout, setting up rides and tearing them down, constantly moving from town to town. He worked as a golf caddy, carrying bags for wealthy men who probably never gave him a second thought. He took whatever work he could find, always searching for something more, something that would make use of his unique physical presence. And then fate intervened in the most unexpected way. Norman found himself in Las Vegas, working as a deputy sheriff. Think about that. The man who would become Cheyenne Bodie, television's most famous lawman, actually wore a real badge first. But Vegas in the early 1950s was a very different place from the sanitized, corporate resort city it is today. It was raw, dangerous, controlled by mobsters, and filled with desperate people making desperate choices. Norman saw things during his time as a deputy that would make their way into his later performances. A certain weariness in the eyes, an understanding that justice isn't always clean and simple. One day, while working as a sheriff's deputy, Norman met someone who would change everything. An associate of actress Teresa Wright saw him and was struck by his appearance. Not just his height or his physique, but something about his presence, the way he carried himself with quiet dignity. This chance encounter led to an introduction, which led to an audition, which led to a small role in a film you might have heard of, Cecil B. DeMille's epic, The Ten Commandments. Now, Norman didn't have any lines in the film. He was essentially a glorified extra, a soldier in Pharaoh's army. But he was there on a Hollywood set, surrounded by massive sets and hundreds of extras and Oscar-winning actors. And something clicked. He watched how the cameras worked, how the directors communicated, how the actors prepared. And he thought, I could do this. I want to do this. But Hollywood is littered with the broken dreams of people who thought they could make it. Norman Eugene Walker needed more than dreams. He needed a break. And in 1955, he got one. Warner Brothers was developing something revolutionary for television. They wanted to create an hour-long Western series, something that had never been attempted before. Most TV shows at the time were 30 minutes. An hour-long format was risky, expensive, and uncertain. They needed someone special to carry it. They needed someone who looked like they had stepped out of a frontier legend. They needed someone physically imposing enough to be believable as a man who could handle any challenge the Old West threw at him. They held auditions, and Norman Eugene Walker walked in. Legend has it that when Norman entered the audition room, the decision was almost instantaneous. Here was a man who stood 6 feet 6 inches tall, with shoulders broader than most doorways, a chest that strained against any shirt, and yet a face that conveyed gentleness and integrity. This wasn't just another actor. This was Cheyenne Bodie incarnate. There was just one problem. Norman Eugene Walker wasn't exactly a name that rolled off the tongue. Hollywood needed something stronger, more memorable, more Western. And so Norman Eugene Walker from Hartford, Illinois, became Clint Walker. The name had power. It sounded like someone who had been born with a six-shooter in his hand. And on September 20th, 1955, when Cheyenne premiered on ABC television, American popular culture changed forever. Cheyenne wasn't just successful. It was a phenomenon. It single-handedly launched the Western television craze that would dominate the small screen for the next 2 decades. Within a year, networks were scrambling to develop their own Western series. Gunsmoke, Have Gun Will Travel, Maverick, Wagon Train, Rawhide, they all owed their existence to the path that Cheyenne blazed. And at the center of it all was Clint Walker, playing Cheyenne Bodie, a wandering frontiersman who drifted from town to town, helping people in trouble, fighting for justice, and never staying long enough to put down roots. The character resonated with post-war America. Here was a man of principle in an unprincipled world. A man who solved problems with integrity first and fists only when necessary. A man who was strong enough to be gentle. Fathers wanted to be him. Sons wanted to grow up to be him. And everyone tuned in week after week to watch his adventures. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. Clint Walker was making Warner Brothers a fortune. Cheyenne was one of the most popular shows on television. The studio was licensing Cheyenne merchandise, making money hand over fist. And Clint Walker? He was making $1,500 per week. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, and in the 1950s, it certainly wasn't poverty wages. But here's the thing. Warner Brothers was making millions from the show, and Clint Walker was the show. Without him, there was no Cheyenne. He was working brutal hours, doing many of his own stunts, carrying the entire production on those massive shoulders. And he was making a fraction of what the studio was earning from his labor. Even more frustrating, when Walker had signed his contract, Warner Brothers had promised him opportunities to make feature films, chances to expand his career beyond television. But those opportunities never materialized. The studio wanted him locked into Cheyenne and nothing else. So in 1958, at the height of the show's popularity, Clint Walker did something that shocked Hollywood. He walked away. Right in the middle of the series, one of the biggest television stars in America simply quit. He told Warner Brothers he was done unless they renegotiated his contract, gave him a reasonable share of the profits, and allowed him to pursue film roles. The studio's response? They thought he was bluffing. They thought he needed them more than they needed him. They thought he'd come crawling back within weeks. They were wrong. Clint Walker was many things, but he was not a man who made idle threats. He had grown up with nothing, worked brutal jobs from childhood, sailed dangerous seas at 17. He knew how to survive without Hollywood. The question was, could Cheyenne survive without him? Warner Brothers scrambled. They couldn't just cancel one of their biggest hits. So they made a desperate move. They brought in Ty Harden to play a character named Bronco Lane in episodes of Cheyenne. It was a bizarre solution, essentially trying to continue a show about a specific character by having a different character fill the same slot. Audiences were confused and angry. This wasn't what they had signed up for. They wanted Cheyenne Bodie. They wanted Clint Walker. The ratings began to slip. Fan mail poured in demanding Walker's return. And finally, after 8 months, Warner Brothers blinked. They came back to the negotiating table, this time serious about making a deal. Clint Walker had won. He returned to Cheyenne with a better contract, profit participation, and the freedom to make films. He had stood up to the Hollywood machine and won, something very few actors of that era managed to do. The show continued successfully until 1962, making Clint Walker one of the most recognizable faces in America. And true to the renegotiated contract, he began appearing in feature films. In 1966, he landed a role that would introduce him to a whole new audience: The Dirty Dozen. This World War II film featured an incredible ensemble cast: Lee Marvin, Ernest Borgnine, Charles Bronson, Jim Brown, Telly Savalas, Donald Sutherland, and Clint Walker as Samson Posey. Walker's performance was remarkable because he played against type. Instead of the strong, confident hero, he portrayed a deeply religious, somewhat simple Native American man who was terrified of violence. It was nuanced acting that showed Walker had range beyond the stoic cowboy persona. The Dirty Dozen was a massive hit, further cementing Walker's status as a legitimate movie star. Life seemed to be going perfectly. He had conquered television, succeeded in films, won his battle with a major studio, and built a career that had exceeded his wildest dreams. He had married Verna Garver in 1948, and they had a daughter, Valerie, born in 1950. Everything looked ideal from the outside. But as is so often the case, the public image and private reality were very different things. The marriage to Verna was struggling. The pressures of fame, the long hours on set, the constant travel, it all took a toll. In 1968, after 20 years of marriage, Clint and Verna divorced. It was amicable as divorces go, but it was still a failure, still painful, especially for their daughter Valerie. But none of that, not the contract battles, not the divorce, not the pressures of fame, none of it prepared anyone for what happened in May of 1971. Clint Walker, age 44, was at the peak of his physical condition. Remember, this was a man who had built a custom gym at his home. Vince Gironda, one of the most respected bodybuilding trainers of the era, had called Walker the strongest and best-built man in Hollywood. This wasn't hyperbole. Walker had developed his physique naturally, long before steroids became common, through disciplined training and clean living. He looked invincible, which makes what happened next even more shocking. Walker decided to take a ski trip to Mammoth Mountain in California. It was May, late in the ski season, but the conditions were still good. Walker was an experienced outdoorsman, comfortable in challenging environments. He had no reason to think this trip would be anything other than an enjoyable getaway. He was following the contours of the irregular terrain, navigating the twists and turns of the mountain. And then something went wrong. Exactly what caused it isn't entirely clear. Perhaps a miscalculation, perhaps an unexpected patch of ice, perhaps just terrible luck. But suddenly Walker was falling, tumbling out of control down the mountainside. His body crashed into trees and rocks, momentum building, completely unable to stop himself. And then came the impact that should have killed him instantly. As Walker fell, he collided with his own ski pole in such a way that the pole became a spear. It pierced through his chest cavity and went directly into his heart. Not near his heart. Not into his lung. Through his heart. The pole had literally skewered one of the most vital organs in his body. The pain was indescribable, beyond anything even his tough-as-nails constitution could process. Blood poured from the wound. Other skiers saw what happened and immediately called for help, but everyone who witnessed the accident assumed they were looking at a dead man. There was simply no way someone survives that kind of injury. Somehow, Walker remained conscious long enough to be transported down the mountain. The ski patrol worked frantically, knowing they were almost certainly dealing with a fatal injury, but doing everything possible anyway. Walker was rushed to the nearest hospital, where doctors took one look at the injury and, quite frankly, gave up hope. This wasn't a case where medical skill was going to make a difference. When a ski pole goes through someone's heart, the person dies. It's not a question of if, but when. Two doctors examined Walker and pronounced him dead. They pulled a sheet over his face. They began the paperwork. His family was notified to prepare for the worst. And then something extraordinary happened. Something that, decades later, people still struggle to explain. A third doctor entered the room. He wasn't the attending physician. He wasn't even supposed to be there. But something made him walk over to the body of Clint Walker and take one more look. He pulled back the sheet and placed his hand on Walker's neck, checking for a pulse even though two of his colleagues had already confirmed there was none. And he felt something. It was barely there, so faint it was almost imaginary. But it was there. "This man is not dead," the doctor said. The other physicians thought he was wrong. They had checked. There had been no pulse, no respiration, no signs of life. But this doctor insisted. He had felt something. And if there was even a chance, even the smallest possibility that Clint Walker was still alive, they had to act. What followed was emergency surgery that lasted hours. The cardiac surgeon later said it was the most delicate operation of his entire career. The ski pole had punctured the heart, but incredibly miraculously, it had somehow missed the major blood vessels and chambers in such a way that the damage, while catastrophic, wasn't instantly fatal. It was a 1 in a million chance. If the pole had entered from a slightly different angle, Walker would have died on the mountain. If it had penetrated a fraction of an inch deeper, he would have bled out before reaching the hospital. If that third doctor hadn't decided to check one more time, Walker would have been sent to the morgue while technically still alive. The surgery involved repairing the heart muscle, stopping internal bleeding, and praying that infection wouldn't set in. The doctors gave Walker's family the prognosis. If he survives the next 48 hours, he might have a chance. But the odds were still overwhelmingly against him. Clint Walker didn't just survive the next 48 hours. 2 months later, just 2 months after being pronounced dead with a ski pole through his heart, he was back on a movie set filming. The doctors were astounded. They had never seen anyone recover so quickly from such a catastrophic injury. Walker attributed his survival to 3 things. His physical conditioning, which gave him a stronger-than-average heart to begin with, his mental toughness, developed through years of hardship, and something he described as divine intervention. He had experienced something during the time he was clinically dead, something he called an out-of-body experience. He later described feeling a sense of peace, of being outside his body, of knowing he had a choice to make. And he chose to come back. He wasn't finished yet. The near-death experience changed Walker in profound ways. He had always been a private person, somewhat reserved despite his fame. But after the accident, he became even more introspective. He started thinking seriously about spirituality, about purpose, about what really mattered in life. He had faced death and returned, and that kind of experience alters a person fundamentally. But he didn't become preachy or somber. If anything, he developed an even deeper appreciation for life, for simple pleasures, for the gift of each new day. Those who worked with him after the accident noticed the change. There was a calmness to him, a lack of urgency about the petty things that drive most people crazy. When you've been dead and come back, Hollywood drama doesn't seem quite so important anymore. In 1974, 3 years after his miraculous survival, Walker married Giselle Hennessy. This marriage was different from his first. Walker was older, wiser, more aware of what mattered. Giselle became his anchor, his partner in the truest sense. They built a life together away from the Hollywood spotlight, cherishing privacy and normalcy. The marriage lasted 20 years, until Giselle's death in 1994. Those who knew them said it was one of the most solid marriages in an industry famous for broken relationships. Walker was devastated by her loss, but he had learned through his own near-death experience that love transcends physical existence. He mourned deeply, but without bitterness. 3 years after Giselle's death, Walker married Susan Cavallari in 1997. This was his third and final marriage, a late-life companionship that brought him comfort and joy in his later years. Susan was with him for the final 2 decades of his life, and by all accounts, they were very happy together. Walker had finally found the peace in his personal life that had eluded him for so long. But throughout all these relationships, one constant remained: his relationship with his daughter, Valerie. Remember earlier we mentioned that Clint and his first wife Verna had a daughter? Well, Valerie Walker had her own remarkable story, one that made her father incredibly proud. Valerie Walker was born in 1950, right as her father's career was taking off. Growing up as Clint Walker's daughter came with unique challenges. There was the lack of privacy, the constant attention, the pressure of living up to a famous name. Many children of celebrities crumble under that pressure or try desperately to replicate their parents' success. Valerie Walker did neither. She looked at her father, this strong, principled man who blazed his own trail, and decided she would do the same. But she wouldn't do it in Hollywood. Valerie Walker became one of the first female airline pilots in the United States. Think about what that means. In the 1970s and early 80s, aviation was an overwhelmingly male field. Female pilots were rare enough to be noteworthy. Female airline captains were even rarer. Valerie didn't just fly planes. She became a captain, responsible for million-dollar aircraft and hundreds of passengers' lives. She also became a flight instructor, teaching others to fly. And if that wasn't enough, she worked with police air control, flying both fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters in service of law enforcement. Clint Walker had every reason to be proud. His daughter had taken the values he tried to instill, courage, determination, breaking barriers, serving others, and applied them in her own life. She had succeeded in a demanding field on her own merits, not because of her famous name. If anything, being Clint Walker's daughter probably made things harder for her, as she constantly had to prove she wasn't receiving special treatment. Valerie Walker proved herself over and over, becoming a respected professional in aviation. The parallel is striking. Both father and daughter were pioneers, both broke barriers, both succeeded in fields where physical presence and mental toughness were essential. As Walker aged, he gradually stepped back from acting. His last significant role was a voice part in the animated film Small Soldiers in 1998. By then, he was in his 70s, and his body, despite its remarkable recovery from the ski pole incident, bore the accumulation of decades of stunt work and physical demands. He had broken bones, torn muscles, and suffered countless bruises over the years, all part of the price of doing his own stunts. But he had no regrets. He had lived exactly the kind of life he wanted, on his own terms, without compromise, with integrity intact. He retreated from the public eye, spending time with family, enjoying the outdoors, reflecting on an extraordinary life. But here's something that most people don't know, something that adds another layer to the Clint Walker story. Throughout his years of fame, Walker maintained an intensely private personal life. He didn't seek publicity. He didn't do the Hollywood party circuit. He didn't court controversy or seek attention. This was partly his nature. He was genuinely a reserved, modest person. But it was also strategic. Walker understood something that many celebrities never figure out. The more mystery you maintain, the more powerful your public image becomes. By keeping his personal life private, he remained Cheyenne Bodie in the public consciousness. He didn't shatter the illusion by being seen drunk at nightclubs or getting into public feuds or any of the other destructive behaviors that ruined so many Hollywood careers. However, this privacy came at a cost. There were rumors, whispers, speculation about Walker's life behind closed doors. Some of these rumors were innocent curiosity. Others were more malicious. In the decades since his death, various stories have circulated, some true, some exaggerated, some completely fabricated. The truth, as is usually the case, is more complex and more human than the myths. Walker struggled with some of the same demons many performers face. The pressure of being the strong, silent hero while dealing with very real fears and insecurities. The challenge of maintaining physical perfection year after year in an industry that discards people the moment they show weakness. The difficulty of sustaining relationships when your work demands so much of your time and energy. The isolation that comes from being put on a pedestal. There have been claims that Walker struggled with alcohol at various points in his life. Some sources suggest that the pressures of fame and the constant need to be on drove him to drink more than was healthy. If true, this would make him entirely typical of his generation of Hollywood stars. Drinking was not only accepted, but expected in the Hollywood of the 1950s and 60s. It was how people socialized, how they dealt with stress, how they numbed the constant anxiety of an industry that could end your career at any moment. Walker, if he did struggle with alcohol, managed it better than most. He never had public incidents of drunkenness, never got arrested for drunk driving, never showed up to work unable to perform. If he battled this demon, he did so privately and ultimately successfully, which would be entirely consistent with his character. Another aspect of Walker's life that deserves attention is his approach to his physique and training. In an era when steroids and performance-enhancing drugs were becoming common in Hollywood, Walker famously refused to use them. He built his incredible body through disciplined training, proper nutrition, and genetics. Vince Gironda, the legendary bodybuilding trainer, studied Walker's physique and training methods extensively. Gironda said Walker represented what was possible naturally, without chemical enhancement. Walker's training routine was surprisingly simple by today's standards. He favored basic exercises: push-ups, pull-ups, dips, rope climbing, and some weighted exercises with barbells and dumbbells. He trained consistently but not obsessively, usually working out for about an hour a day, 4 to 5 days per week. He believed in full-body workouts rather than splitting muscle groups. He emphasized proper form over heavy weight. And crucially, he prioritized rest and recovery, understanding that muscles grow when you're resting, not when you're training. His diet was equally straightforward. Walker ate simple, whole foods. Lots of protein from meat, eggs, and dairy. Plenty of vegetables. Some fruits. Limited processed foods. No supplements beyond basic vitamins. He drank minimal alcohol, didn't smoke, and maintained this lifestyle for decades. The result was a physique that looked impressive on screen, but also functioned remarkably well in real life. This wasn't a bodybuilder's physique designed purely for show. This was a working man's body, built for actual physical demands. When Walker did his own stunts, fought his own fight scenes, rode horses for hours, his body was up to the task because it was built for function, not just appearance. This might seem unremarkable now, but in the steroid-fueled decades that followed, Walker's natural approach became increasingly rare in Hollywood. Walker's relationship with fame itself was complicated. On one hand, fame gave him opportunities he never could have imagined as a poor kid from Illinois. It brought wealth, respect, the ability to provide for his family, and the platform to tell stories he believed in. On the other hand, fame was a prison of sorts. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. He couldn't have a private moment in public. Every action was scrutinized. Every word could be misinterpreted. He had to constantly maintain the image of the hero, even when he was tired, frustrated, or dealing with personal problems. He once said in an interview that the hardest part of being famous wasn't the work or the pressure, but the loss of anonymity, the inability to just be a regular person doing regular things. As the decades passed and the Western genre faded from popularity, Walker found himself in an interesting position. He was still famous, still respected, but no longer in demand. Hollywood had moved on to different kinds of heroes, different kinds of stories. Younger actors had taken center stage. It would have been easy to become bitter, to complain about how the industry had forgotten him. But Walker didn't do that. He accepted the natural progression of things with grace. He had had his time in the spotlight, and it had been glorious. Now it was time for others to have their turn. He stayed connected to his fans through occasional appearances at Western film festivals and autograph shows, where he was always gracious, always willing to sign another photo or shake another hand. The final 2 decades of Walker's life were spent largely out of the public eye. He and his wife Susan lived quietly, enjoying simple pleasures. He maintained his fitness routine, though adapted to his aging body. He spent time outdoors, hiking and enjoying nature. He reconnected with old friends from his days in the industry. He watched with interest as Westerns experienced periodic revivals, though he never sought to return to acting. He had said what he needed to say through his work. He had left his mark. He was at peace with his legacy. Those who visited him in these later years reported that he seemed genuinely happy, more content than he had been during his fame. He had finally found what he had been searching for all along: peace, purpose, and authentic connection. On May 21, 2018, 9 days before what would have been his 91st birthday, Clint Walker passed away at his home in Grass Valley, California. He died peacefully, surrounded by family. The immediate cause of death was congestive heart failure, a cruel irony considering that the same heart had survived being pierced by a ski pole 47 years earlier. But that heart had finally given all it could give. News of his death spread quickly through the entertainment industry and among Western fans worldwide. Tributes poured in from actors, directors, and countless fans whose childhoods had been shaped by watching Cheyenne ride into town every week to set things right. The tributes were remarkably consistent in their themes. Walker had been a true gentleman, a professional, a man of integrity, someone who represented the best values of his era. But here's the thing about Clint Walker's legacy. It's not just about the roles he played or the shows he was in. It's about what he represented and continues to represent. In a cynical age, Walker stood for sincerity. In an age of compromise, he stood for principle. In an age of image over substance, he was the real deal. He didn't pretend to be tough. He was tough, forged by genuine hardship. He didn't pretend to have values. He lived them, even when it cost him professionally. He didn't pretend to be a hero. He quietly did heroic things, like surviving impossible injuries and standing up to powerful studios and raising a daughter who would become a pioneer in her own right. The stories about Clint Walker that nobody believed weren't sensationalized tabloid fodder. They were stories of genuine courage, real survival, actual integrity, authentic character. They seemed too good to be true because we've become accustomed to heroes who turn out to be flawed hypocrites. But Walker was different. Consider the full arc of his life. From poverty to prosperity, from obscurity to fame, from death itself back to life. Consider the barriers he broke, the stands he took, the example he set. Consider that he became one of the most recognizable faces in America without compromising his values or selling out his principles. Consider that he walked away from a hit show at the peak of its success because he knew his worth and refused to be exploited. Consider that he survived an injury that should have killed him and came back stronger. Consider that his daughter followed in his footsteps of courage and pioneering spirit. Consider that 3 different women loved him enough to marry him, and that by all accounts, he was a devoted husband each time. Consider that he maintained his dignity and grace through decades in an industry that chews people up and spits them out. The reason nobody believed these stories about Clint Walker is because they challenge our cynical assumptions. We expect our heroes to have feet of clay, to disappoint us, to reveal themselves as frauds. We expect dramatic falls from grace, addiction scandals, hidden corruption. What we don't expect is a genuinely good person who lived a genuinely remarkable life with genuinely admirable character. That's so rare it seems fictional. But Clint Walker was real. The ski pole through his heart was real. His battle with Warner Brothers was real. His commitment to natural bodybuilding was real. His pioneering role in television history was real. His daughter's aviation career was real. His 3 marriages, his quiet later years, his peaceful death, all real. The evidence is overwhelming once you start looking at it. Birth certificates and military records and hospital reports and contract documents and thousands of hours of filmed performances and testimony from hundreds of people who knew him. So why do we find it so hard to believe? Perhaps because belief in genuine heroism has become more difficult in an age of constant exposure, where we see every flaw and failure of every public figure. Perhaps because we've been disappointed so many times by people who seemed admirable until they weren't. Perhaps because the gap between Clint Walker's generation and our own has widened to the point where the values that motivated him seem foreign, almost quaint. Or perhaps because believing in Clint Walker means believing that we could be better than we are, that we could stand up for our principles, that we could face death and come back stronger, that we could be genuinely heroic in our own lives. And that's a challenging belief to maintain when we're struggling with our own fears and compromises and failures. But the truth remains the truth, regardless of whether we find it easy to believe. Clint Walker lived an extraordinary life. He rose from poverty to become a television icon. He launched a genre that dominated popular culture for decades. He stood up to studio executives when they tried to exploit him. He survived being impaled through the heart. He raised a daughter who became a pioneering female pilot. He married 3 times and by all accounts was a good husband. He maintained his physical and moral integrity through decades in Hollywood. He handled fame with grace and aging with dignity. He left a body of work that entertained millions and continues to entertain new generations discovering classic television. And he did all of it while remaining fundamentally decent, honest, and true to himself. The legacy of Clint Walker extends beyond entertainment history. He represents a type of masculinity that's largely disappeared from popular culture. Not toxic masculinity based on domination and aggression, but protective masculinity based on strength used in service of others. Cheyenne Bodie didn't go looking for fights, but he didn't back down from them either when justice demanded action. He was gentle with the vulnerable and firm with the predatory. He was more likely to talk his way out of a situation than shoot his way out, but he was capable of both. He had principles but wasn't self-righteous. He helped people because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected thanks or recognition. These qualities reflected Walker's own character, and they resonated with audiences because they represented an ideal worth aspiring to. Whether we can achieve that ideal is less important than the fact that we recognize it as valuable. Walker embodied values that shouldn't go out of style: courage, integrity, humility, service, resilience. These aren't old-fashioned concepts. They're timeless. Every generation needs these qualities. Every society benefits when individuals embody them. In the years since Walker's death, there's been a quiet resurgence of interest in classic westerns and the stars who made them. Younger viewers discovering Cheyenne for the first time are struck by how different it feels from modern entertainment. The pacing is slower, more deliberate. The stories are simpler, more direct. The hero is uncomplicated, not tormented by inner demons or moral ambiguity. Some critics dismiss this as simplistic or unrealistic, but others recognize it as refreshing, a reminder that entertainment can be uplifting, that heroes can be admirable, that stories can inspire without cynicism. Walker's performances have aged remarkably well precisely because he didn't rely on gimmicks or irony. He played Cheyenne Bodie straight, with sincerity and commitment. That authenticity transcends the era in which it was produced. There's also been renewed interest in Walker's approach to fitness and natural bodybuilding. In an age of performance-enhancing drugs, questionable supplements, and often unhealthy extreme fitness regimens, Walker's simple, sustainable approach stands as an alternative model. You don't need steroids or complicated programs or expensive equipment. You need consistency, proper nutrition, adequate rest, and patience. Walker built his physique over years, not months. He maintained it through decades, not just for a single film role. He was still impressively fit in his 60s and 70s. That's the real test of a fitness approach. Not what you look like at 25, but whether you can sustain health and vitality into old age. Walker passed that test with distinction. Modern fitness enthusiasts studying his methods have found that they work remarkably well, producing steady, sustainable results without the health risks associated with more extreme approaches. If Clint Walker were starting his career today, would he succeed? It's an interesting question. On one hand, his physical presence would still be remarkable, his natural charisma still evident. On the other hand, modern Hollywood might not know what to do with him. He wouldn't fit neatly into current categories. Too big and physical for romantic lead roles, but too gentle and principled for action villain roles. Too straightforward for the kind of complex, morally ambiguous characters that dominate prestige television. Perhaps he would find his niche in superhero films, playing characters who embody old-fashioned heroism. Or perhaps he would struggle, finding that his particular combination of qualities doesn't resonate with contemporary audiences. It's impossible to know. But what we can say with certainty is that Walker succeeded spectacularly in his own era, and that success was built on authentic qualities that didn't depend on trends or fashions. The final measure of any life is not fame or wealth or accomplishments, though Walker had all three. The final measure is whether the person lived according to their values, whether they treated people with dignity, whether they left the world a bit better than they found it. By these measures, Clint Walker's life was an unqualified success. He broke barriers in television, pioneering a format that opened doors for countless others. He stood up for fair treatment, making it easier for future actors to negotiate better deals. He portrayed heroism in a way that inspired rather than corrupted. He raised a daughter who became a pioneer herself. He faced death and chose life, then lived the rest of his days with gratitude and grace. He remained faithful to his principles, even when it would have been easier to compromise. And he did all of this without seeking credit or demanding recognition. He simply lived his life the best way he knew how. So when you hear these Clint Walker stories that seem too incredible to believe, remember that truth is often stranger than fiction. Remember that real people sometimes do genuinely extraordinary things. Remember that heroes aren't myths. They're humans who choose courage over comfort, principle over convenience, integrity over advantage. Clint Walker was such a person. The 6'6" giant from Hartford, Illinois, who became Cheyenne Bodie, who stood up to Warner Brothers, who survived death itself, who built his body without shortcuts, who raised a pioneering daughter, who handled fame with grace and aging with dignity. These stories are all true. The evidence is overwhelming. The witnesses are countless. The legacy is undeniable. Norman Eugene Walker, known to the world as Clint Walker, lived a life that challenges our cynicism and reminds us that genuine heroism is possible. And that might be the most unbelievable story of all. That such a person actually existed, walked among us, left his mark, and remains an inspiration decades after his final ride into the sunset.